Good evening. You're watching channel 342 RD News. I'm your host, Sean Corder. Nearly 4 decades ago, on the brisk Ukrainian morning, the Chernobyl nuclear plant prepared to do a routine shutdown of reactor number 4 while simultaneously testing how long the reactor's turbines would be able to turn should the main power source be cut off. Just the previous year, they had done the same test. The difference? Through a combination of sheer ignorance, ill-trained personnel, and a flawed reactor design, a catastrophic series of events would shake the world to its core. We go now to field correspondent Martin Gutierrez. Martin?
Hi, Sean. So we have learned that there has been about a total of 30 victims following the explosion of the Chernobyl explosion. Of these 30 victims, 2 of them were the power plant workers that were on the scene the night of the explosion. One of them had died at the scene and the other one had died at the hospital. Following that, the next death victims were the firemen who arrived at the scene when the explosion had happened. Their effort to put out the fire caused them their lives pretty much, in the sense that they weren't prepared for this type of fire. They weren't knowledgeable of the effects that of radiation, so they weren't wearing the correct protection, and they died, I think it was about 3 months following the explosion, and this was due to acute radiation syndrome. The acute radiation syndrome typically occurs when a person has received about more than 700 milligrams of radiation in a short amount of time. It had been estimated that these firemen received about 20,000 milligrams of radiation. So some of the common symptoms of acute radiation syndrome typically includes your gastrointestinal tract, which affects you by causing like vomiting, some nausea, as well as headaches, fevers, and skin burns. And then the following 22 death victims that occurred about the same 3 months after the explosion were also because of acute radiation syndrome. We then learned that the cleaning efforts following the explosion kind of first began with the liquidators, which were the emergency workers, and they were almost like if they were drafted from the whole Soviet Union to help clean up the whole explosion. These workers, it was about thousands of men were called upon, and they kind of first began with having pilots flying over the power plant, dropping anything from sand, clay, boron, and lead into the burning core, and hope to slow the radioactive emission. So they then created an underground tunnel where they were pumping liquid nitrogen and underneath to the core, so they were able to cool it down and stop the heating from exposing more radiation into the world. Lastly, they constructed the sarcophagus, which was a huge building made out of steel and concrete over the power plant. So they pretty much like housed it. And this is what there is today, actually. And it pretty much prevented the spread of any of radiation escaping the building.
Truly electrifying information. You stay safe out there, Martin. We move on now to local environmentalist Nichole Johnson with her report. Nichole, are you with us?
Hi. Thank you for inviting me today, Sean. We now know that the disaster at Chernobyl released 4 times the amount of radiation than that of Hiroshima. And that radiation is going to have its way with the land around it. This mapping here shows the predicted fallout and how far it'll travel. The deeper the red, the more Curie the square kilometer. It's predicted that the radiation will travel anywhere close to 300 miles away from the explosion site. I mean, inverse square law shows us and has taught us that the more distance, the less intense the radiation. So those that are further away from the site, you'll receive less amounts of radiation dose. So that's a good thing, but still is traveling pretty far. The dust in the air is radiated, and the winds are carrying that dust all around the country. And many of the surrounding population, including farmland and stuff, those waterways and the land are going to be affected, as well as the animals and the plants that are being produced to be sold. When it comes to this informational graphic, it just basically shows how the land is receiving this radiation dose, and that it's going into rivers where fish are, where fishermen fish and use these animals as food source. Well, that's no longer an option. It's just too dangerous. It's too dangerous to drink cow's milk. 150 farms in the area have already been shut down, and anybody trying to sell produce from these farms will definitely be ridiculed. I mean, where else can we go with this? I mean, researchers, they're predicting the worst. Me personally, I think that once the land is evacuated of all human life, I think nature is gonna come reclaim those forsaken lands. They're gonna come back, and we might even find new wildlife that we've never even seen before there. But that's just me. It's a waiting game at this point. Thanks, Sean.
Now, Nichole, talk about a hostile work environment. We go now to junior field reporter Jessie Cahill with her report on the socioeconomic impact of the Chernobyl disaster. Jessie?
Thanks, Sean. Hey everyone, so there's a few things that you can expect to be seen with this type of devastating explosion. Not only is there going to be mass destruction to the surrounding land, but you're also going to see a massive increase in poverty. There's an expectation of 300,000 plus people to be evacuated from Chernobyl and moved across Ukraine. In Belarus, Ukraine, and northwestern Ukraine, you can also expect massive radioactive fallout. Due to weather patterns changing and rain on the horizon, these towns are going to be massively affected. Not only is the farmland going to be destroyed from the radioactive material seeping into the ground and affecting crops, but you're also going to have all of the farm animals be containing that product. Once these animals contain that product, they are no longer viable and able to be sold on the market. There's going to be a lot of emptying and destruction of crops and animal byproducts across Ukraine. The last thing that you can expect to see is an anti-global nuclear movement that we believe is on the horizon. Now, with this anti-global nuclear movement, there is going to be a lot of new laws set in place in order to keep towns safe that have nuclear power plants.
And now we cut back to Sean.
Thank you, Jessie. All disasters, however, are not without their lessons learned. We go now to field analyst Don LePonte. Don?
I am here at the site of the disaster 35 years later, in front of this massive concrete and steel shelter that surrounds reactor number 4, which is called the sarcophagus. It's been 22 years since the last receptor was shut down, and they are in the decommissioning phase, which is expected to take decades. There is an 18-mile radius around the power plant known as the exclusion zone, where radioactive isotopes still linger. There are 187 small communities that are virtually abandoned to this day. A few residents have returned to their homes against advice from experts, but children are not allowed to live in the exclusion zone. The thyroid gland of children is particularly susceptible to the uptake of radioactive iodine, and there have been at least 1,800 documented cases of thyroid cancer in people who were between the ages of 0 and 14 at the time of the explosion. It is thought to be largely due to eating contaminated food and drinking milk from cows that had been eating radioactive grass. Scientists have since learned that there may be a relatively short period of latency for thyroid cancer, and many advances have been made in the treatment of young patients with thyroid cancer. Several recent studies have shown an increase in leukemia in emergency workers and cleanup workers, where the median age of diagnosis in this population was 57 years old, compared to the median age of diagnosis in the US of 72. The increase in number of cataracts in cleanup workers led to a change in the threshold dose limits for occupationally exposed persons, such as radiologic technologists. Clinical and population-based studies since the explosion have provided invaluable insights into the association between radiation exposure and the long-term health risks of leukemia, cardiovascular disease, cataracts, and thyroid disease. Another important lesson from the disaster at Chernobyl is how agencies have added to their disaster preparedness plans by making psychological and emotional support immediately available to the survivors of large-scale disasters, such as the September 11th terrorist attacks on New York. A valuable lesson learned. Sean?
A wise man once said, "The night is darkest just before the dawn," truly reshaping an ecological disaster into a learning experience for the entire world. Thank you, Don. From all of us here at Channel 342, we'd like to thank you for tuning in. We'd like a special shout out for our sponsor, Angel Customs. If you want to meet real angels, ride our motorcycles. Sean Corder, signing off.